and welcome to everyone at home and my live audience, my cats, to my Abby Lee Miller pyramid ranking version, my Abby Lee Miller pyramid ranking of different female reproductive cycles in animals. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to start off with a brief introduction of female reproductive cycles. So they have a couple of things in common. All females start off, or they make what's called an egg, which is a zygote, which contains half of the normal chromosomes of whatever they have. And then that gets combined with a sperm from a male that also has half of the chromosomes. And then they combine to make an egg, and it has all the chromosomes. Generally, the egg will mature. Eggs are high value because they take a lot of energy to produce. They will mature, move down the fallopian tube, be fertilized. If they're not fertilized, different things can happen. We'll talk about that. And then there's a couple different ways that an egg can develop. So there's viviparous, where the egg will develop in the uterus, usually attached to the uterine lining. Ovoviviparous, where the egg does develop inside of the body, but it is kind of like it's a separate egg from the uterus. It's not attached to the uterus. And then there's oviparous, where an egg is laid completely out of the female's body. And there's a couple different hormones that generally go along with these cycles as well. Kisspeptins have been found in each of these types besides birds. So that kisspeptins will trigger gonadotropin releasing hormones, which will send a signal to release luteinizing hormones, which triggers ovulation, and follicle stimulating hormone, which stimulates the growth of follicles in the ovaries. And the follicles are what the egg is released from. And then estrogen is the inhibitory or stimulating hormone for luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And then progesterone is the inhibitory hormone that gets turned on during pregnancy. So it's what pauses these cycles during pregnancy. All right, now let's get to the pyramid. On the bottom of our pyramid, mammals, specifically the menstrual cycle. I may be biased because this is what I experience, and I personally think it's kind of sucks, but I also don't see the point in shedding our uterine lining. And I don't know what the advantage of it is, but it has evolved separately 4 times, so clearly there's something that is good for it. It's evolved in primates, 4 species of bats, the elephant shrew, and a species of spiny mouse. So I guess it has something going for it. It has 4 different stages. Get my paper. It's got the follicular, ovulatory, ovulation, luteal, and menstrual phase. So the follicular phase, I'm going to set this up as the base of our cycles firstly. So I'm going to go kind of more in depth than this one. It also is probably what you will understand because we're humans and this is what we experience. The follicular phase is when the egg is maturing and the lining of the uterus is developed. This is followed by ovulation, where the egg is maturing and the lining. This is followed by ovulation, where the egg is released into the fallopian tubes, and this is in humans where the egg, or in the menstrual cycle, where the egg is able to be fertilized. That is followed by the luteal phase, where the egg is released and the uterine lining matures. This is when implantation of the egg into the uterine lining can occur. Lastly, and least, is menstruation. So this is the actual shedding of the uterine lining if there's no implantation, and this is going to overlap into the first phase, the follicular phase. So, yeah, that's basically menstruation for you. So that's our bottom of the pyramid. Just don't particularly enjoy it. So, yeah. Moving on. Now, I know this may upset you, Professor Sear, Dr. Sear, but amphibians. Now, there's nothing particularly bad about this. It's just that there's no one singular cycle that can be pinpointed for amphibians because they're so varying. So there's a lot of different things that can happen with amphibians. They can be oviparous, viviparous, ovoviparous. They can have external or internal fertilization. They can lay broods, or they can have single follicles develop at one time. So nothing super against them, but they're just so wide and varying that I can't very well put them higher because they don't have a set reproductive cycle that can be pinpointed. So, a couple of extra tidbits about amphibians. So they can stall the development of their eggs using estradiol until favorable environmental conditions exist. And they can reproduce continuously, seasonally, opportunistically, based off of environmental factors like the rainfall and temperature. And using estradiol, they can stall the development of their eggs after their follicles begin to develop with estradiol until those favorable environmental conditions are there. Once they are there, the spawning is triggered. The follicles will finish maturing and they'll either be released into the environment, spawning for external fertilization, or they'll be released into the uterus for internal fertilization. Another thing, these guys are non-amniotes, so their eggs are going to be not in amniotic fluid. They're going to be in just kind of like a jelly-like substance. These guys, again, are just kind of unpredictable, so it's not super easy for us to understand how to breed them in captivity. Very different from mammals who experience menstruation. They're pretty well known. We can perform artificial insemination on them because they do have such a similar cycle to humans. Obviously humans have been studied for a long, long time, so we know a lot about them in the menstrual cycle. Amphibians, we don't know that much about, so we don't really know, and we're not as successful in breeding them in captivity. Yeah. Moving on, our last one on the bottom of the pyramid. Mammals, estrus. The estrus cycle, nothing in particular against the estrus cycle. It just doesn't stand out to me. It is similar to the menstrual cycle in a lot of ways. It does have four parts to it. So let's get into it. Most mammals experience an estrus cycle. This is also called a heat cycle. So if you've ever heard like, oh, my dog is in heat, that's what it is. So they can bleed a little. That's why some people will say, oh, my dog's on their period. They're not on their period. Dogs don't have periods. But yeah, so it has 4 stages: proestrus, estrus, metastrus, and anastrus. Proestrus, similar to our follicular phase, when the follicle begins to develop. Estrus, when the follicle is fully developed, similar to human ovulation. This is when pregnancy can occur, or fertilization can occur. Metastrus or diestrus is when that uterine lining fully develops. And then if the pregnancy does not occur, fertilization does not occur, this is also when the uterine lining will be reabsorbed or reorganized, as so it's called. And then anestrus is when the animal is like not at a rest period. They're not experiencing a part of the sexual cycle. So this is common in animals that reproduce seasonally. So part of the year they're not experiencing any cycle, and then the rest of the year they are in their estrus cycle. And this can happen as well with pregnancy, illness, stress, and age. So yeah, for both menstruation and estrus, these cycles can be like anywhere from weeks, like us, to days, to years, or not years, but months. So like they can have one estrus cycle a year, essentially. Yeah. So this one's also pretty well understood just because it's other mammals like us, and we have been fairly successful in being able to have artificial insemination and captive breeding efforts with mammals who experience estrus. Hello, Pie. Hi. This is Pie. He's my cat. If he was a girl cat, he would experience estrus, but he's not. Moving on. Our next part of the pyramid, moving up and along. Honestly, these two I feel like could possibly be switched, but there's just one thing that gives it an edge. With our hooks again, we have reptiles. I think reptiles got an edge because I like reptiles and their cycle is a little bit more different. It's going to be 3 stages instead of the 4 stages of mammals. So I think that's interesting. They're also more dependent on things like season and temperature. They have sex-dependent temperature a lot of the time, so sea turtles can have, I believe it's males when it's cooler, females when it's hotter, things like that, which I think is pretty cool. They can also be dependent on rainfall, so but some of them have continuous reproduction and can reproduce anytime they have favorable conditions. They can be seasonal, and that seasonal, they usually will reproduce in the summer or spring, just because those are usually the best conditions that's going to be available. But they can be viviparous, oviviparous, or ovoviviparous as well. So lots of different options. Their cycle, like I said, is in 3 phases. So I'm going to butcher this. Quiescent, which is similar to anestrus, where there's no development of the ovary, they're in a rest period. Again, this usually happens with our seasonal animals. And then after that, the vitellogenic stage, which is when the yolk is forming and the follicles are maturing. This is when estrogen is being produced and fertilization would occur here. Last phase is gravidity or pregnancy. So this was when progesterone will be continually released from a corpus luteum, which they would also have, and either an egg or an embryo is produced, depending on if they are egg-laying or live-bearing. And another thing that they can do, which is pretty cool, is they can store sperm for even months, and then before their ovulation, and use that to fertilize their eggs. Another thing that they can do, which is really cool, which actually birds, amphibians, and fish have also been found to be able to do this, is parthenogenesis. You probably have heard of it because of the ray that was able to do it recently. It was like, everybody was like, oh, it's like a Virgin Mary situation. It was not. It was just parthenogenesis. So, and what that is when reproduction occurs without fertilization of a male. So the offspring are essentially just going to be clones of the mother who gives birth to them. and this is found more commonly in reptiles than any other species. So like the Komodo dragon can do it fairly often. But again, they're a clone, so this usually will only create females or males with only one X chromosome. So they're not able to reproduce after that. But yeah, so that's reptiles. That's my number 3 overall pick. Now, for our number 2, this one I think barely beat out reptiles, but there was just a couple of things that made it cooler. Is fishes. And if it honestly wasn't for cartilaginous fishes, I don't think this would have made it this far up. But cartilaginous conjunctives have some more, have really just one interesting feature about them that I really liked. But let's just go over the basics of bony fishes first. Alright, so for bony fishes, these are fairly similar to amphibians in that they have egg growth, maturation, ovulation, and spawning. They are generally oviparous and will lay eggs and have external fertilization, what's called spawning. That's what most fish use. Their egg growth happens in multiple stages though. So they undergo vitellogenesis, which is like what reptiles underwent. And so vitellogenin is released, hormone, this starts the egg growth. And then similar to amphibians, they can also have a stolen period. However, this generally happens in the ovarian cavity. And because of that, if they wait too long, the eggs can begin to degenerate if not fertilized in time. And then when they're laid and fertilized after that, like amphibians, no hard outer shell, more of like a jelly-like consistency. And if they are idioparous fish, not simiparous, like trout will die after they spawn. If they're idiparous and can reproduce multiple times, then their uterine lining will begin to reorganize like mammals and estrus. Now, my favorite part of these fishes are the cartilaginous fishes. I am having such a hard time pronouncing them. So they can be viviparous, ovoviviparous, or oviparous, which is, I think, pretty cool. They're very varying as well, but I just think they're cooler. So they can have continuous, seasonal, or punctuated breeding. Punctuated breeding is when they reproduce, go through their cycle, and then they have that sort of anestrus time, that rest period where they're not reproducing. So there are fish where they have a cycle of about a year, and they'll be pregnant for about a year, but then they'll wait multiple years before reproducing again. So the thing about cartilaginous fishes that I think is most interesting is the oviducle that they have. So this is a special tube where the egg is released after the ovary, and so this is only in cartilaginous fishes. So the egg is released by the ovary into this tube where the egg structure begins to develop. This is also where fertilization happens, and sperm can also be stored here for later fertilization. And so after this gland, the egg will then go to the uterus, where it either stays and continues to develop into an egg capsule, or an embryo. Yeah. So that's cartilaginous fishes. That's why I think they're pretty cool, and why fishes kind of got the bump over everyone else. And finally, our number 1 category. I didn't think it would be this, because I'm not that interested in. But birds. I was so intrigued to learn about their cycle, which is, it's obviously cycle. but it's different because their eggs are produced sequentially. So this was really interesting. I'll go more into it now. So birds have multiple factors that make them interesting, but I'll just start with the basics. They're usually either active year-round or based on external stimulants. That's generally like temperature. So if they're migratory birds, they'll reproduce based on the temperature and where they're at. So they have 3 phases, and it's pretty unique to them. So they have prenuptial acceleration phase, which is where their follicles are developing sequentially, so one after the other. And then they have, this is where their oviduct will grow significantly. This is when fertilization occurs. And in bird fertilization, it's interesting because they can have multiple sperms enter the egg, but only one will actually complete the fertilization. They also have specialized tubules in their oviducts that allow them to keep sperm for a long time, and allows for that multiple fertilization of sequential eggs without having to remate every time, which, again, just more things that make birds cool with their reproductive cycle. And so after this is the egg laying phase, where the follicles will continue to develop and the egg is formed in that oviduct. Birds will lay those fully formed eggs generally, whether they're fertilized or not. That's like what we see in chickens, obviously, but also the quail, ostriches. That's how we get those eggs that we eat. Then they also experience a rest phase similar to an estrus. This is when the ovary shrinks and is inactive. This obviously doesn't happen to the birds that are reproductive year-round, but this is really common in like migratory birds because they need to keep in mind their weight for those long flights and migrations. So what happens during this is during their migrations, they're generally in this rest period, and so their reproductive organs are at their smallest and they shrink. Again, another thing that makes birds so interesting. And unlike mammals, once they release that egg, instead of producing more progesterone once it's fertilized, they will stop producing progesterone almost entirely after 24 hours, which allows the next follicle to rupture. So that way the next follicle in line can be fertilized and they can continue that sequential egg laying. Again, just another reason why birds are just so interesting in their reproductive cycles. I had no idea. But this is also fairly well understood, and we've had multiple iterations of birds who have been able to successfully had artificial insemination. This isn't perfectly understood, and it doesn't always work, but there's definitely some hope and interesting research that has been done with that as well. So birds, yeah, their reproductive cycle is just really cool and awesome. And then my number 1 reproductive cycle. Let's go to our conclusion. To conclude, understanding reproductive cycles is really important. It helps us understand animal behavior, ecology, population dynamics, things like that. It also helps us, people in like zoos, with captive breeding, and helps us support those endangered species where they need it. It helps us understand how they reproduce and things like that, and how we can support that. It's very essential for conservation efforts to understand what this is and how it happens. I talked about artificial insemination a couple times in this video. Understanding these cycles is essential for artificial insemination in order to understand exactly how and when we can do that with these animals. So very important to to understand these things. Very important to keep learning about the world around us. And I hope you learned something new about reproductive cycles. I loved learning about this. Thought it was super interesting, especially birds, which I had no idea. Yeah, and have a good rest of your day. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks, bye. Pretzel, say goodbye to the video. Pretzel's closing us out.